Everyone watches the boys and walks away with the same conclusion. Homelander is the monster, the villain, the problem that needs to be stopped. But what if that idea is completely wrong? What if Homelander was never the real danger in this story? What if he's just the most visible symptom of something far worse? Because monsters aren't born. They're engineered. Homelander didn't grow up with parents. He didn't learn empathy. He didn't choose power. Power was forced into him before he even understood what being human meant. He was raised in a lab, watched through glass, taught that love was conditional, and that approval had to be earned through fear. So when Homelander finally broke, when he stopped pretending to be the hero everyone wanted, that wasn't the beginning of the problem. That was the result. And once you see who really created Homelander, you realize the true villain of the boys was never the man in the cape. Homelander didn't wake up one day and choose to become a monster. He never had the chance to become anything else. He wasn't raised, he was engineered. No parents, no comfort. No one to teach him where power ends and humanity begins. Instead of a childhood, he was given tests. Instead of affection, he was given observation. Every emotion he showed was documented, evaluated, and corrected, like a malfunction in a machine. From the moment he could understand the world, he was taught one lesson. Love is conditional. Approval is earned. And safety only comes from being useful. When he cried, no one held him. When he was afraid, no one reassured him. Fear wasn't something to be healed, it was something to be eliminated. So he learned early that vulnerability was a weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. Homelander wasn't taught how to connect with people. He was taught how to perform for them. Smile on command. Say the right words. Save the day when the cameras are rolling. Be the hero they need, not the person you are. And over time, the performance became his identity. When the applause stopped, so did his sense of self. That's why Homelander craves admiration. That's why rejection feels like an attack. That's why the smallest loss of approval sends him into rage. This isn't pure narcissism. This is what happens when a human being grows up emotionally starved, taught that love only exists if it's earned through fear and dominance. You can't raise a child in isolation, strip away empathy, replace connection with control, and then act surprised when that child grows into something dangerous. Homelander isn't broken because he's evil. He's broken because he was never allowed to be human in the first place. So when Homelander finally stops pretending, when the mask slips and the violence becomes visible, that moment isn't the beginning of the problem, it's the consequence. The explosion comes long after the damage is done, because by the time Homelander stands above everyone else, incapable of restraint or empathy, the monster has already been built. And all he's doing now is revealing what was always there. Vought didn't create Homelander by accident. They created him by design. This wasn't a scientific breakthrough gone wrong. It was a business plan. From the very beginning, Homelander was never meant to be a person. He was meant to be a product. Something to market, control, and deploy when necessary. Power wasn't the problem. Power without accountability was the goal. Vought understood something dangerous. People don't trust institutions, but they worship symbols. So instead of selling control, they sold hope. Instead of accountability, they sold spectacle. Homelander wasn't raised to protect humanity. He was raised to represent it, wrapped in a flag, smiling for cameras, speaking lines written by executives who would never face the consequences of his actions. They isolated him on purpose, because attachment creates independence. Empathy creates hesitation, and hesitation is bad for profit. A hero who questions orders is a liability. A hero who needs approval is easy to manipulate. So they denied him real relationships, fed his ego, and made sure the only place he could find validation was through public admiration and corporate praise. And when the cracks started to show, Vought didn't intervene. They didn't slow him down. They didn't ask whether this much power should belong to one person. They asked how to manage the optics, how to spin the story, how to make sure the brand survived even if people didn't. Because as long as Homelander looked perfect on screen, everything else was considered acceptable collateral. Vought didn't fail to control Homelander. They succeeded too well. They built a system where image mattered more than life, where responsibility was optional, and where consequences were something to be outsourced or erased. Homelander isn't a flaw in their design. He's proof that the design worked exactly as intended. So when Vought blames Homelander for the chaos he causes, they're not telling the truth. They're shifting it. Because it's easier to point at a monster in a cape than to admit that the real danger is a corporation that decided power should exist without limits, without empathy, and without accountability. Homelander is terrifying, There's no denying that. The violence, the arrogance, the lack of restraint, it's easy to look at him and decide the story ends there. A monster in a cape, a villain that needs to be stopped. But that interpretation is comfortable, because it keeps the blame simple. And simple villains don't ask difficult questions, because if Homelander is the problem, then the system that built him doesn't have to answer for anything. The truth is more unsettling. Homelander isn't the source of the corruption in the boys. He's the proof of it. He's what happens when power is separated from responsibility, when image replaces morality, and when control matters more than care. He didn't break the world on his own. He emerged from a world that decided some people could be tools instead of humans. Vought didn't just create a superhero. They created an environment where consequences were optional, where trauma was ignored if it didn't affect the stock price, where abuse could be justified as necessary as long as the results looked good on camera. Homelander didn't invent this logic. He inherited it and then embodied it. That's why stopping Homelander was never enough. Because even if he disappears, the system remains. The labs are still there. The executives are still there. The idea that power should exist without limits is still there. Remove one monster and another will take his place. Not because the people are evil, but because the structure rewards it. And that's the most uncomfortable realization of all. The real villain of the boys doesn't fly. It doesn't shoot lasers. It doesn't wear a costume. It sits in boardrooms. It signs contracts. It calls exploitation innovation and calls control security. It creates gods and then pretends to be shocked when they stop listening. Homelander didn't fall from grace. He was never given grace to begin with. He was built without empathy, raised without love, and unleashed without limits. Expecting him to be anything else was the real fantasy. The tragedy isn't that Homelander became a monster. The tragedy is that everyone who made him possible believed they wouldn't have to face what they created. So when you watch The Boys and you feel that fear, that anger, that disgust, don't just look at the man in the sky. Look at the system beneath him. Because Homelander is loud, he's violent, he's impossible to ignore. But the real danger is quieter, more polished, more believable. And that's why the real villain was never Homelander. It was the world that decided a monster was acceptable, as long as it sold. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more character deep dives like this, make sure to subscribe.